I've not only enjoyed the joy of service and community, but having this pick one problem and just work away at it. Because I know that, many people that I come into encounter with get really paralyzed by the size of problems in the world, by the size of things that need to change. And it's crushing when you can't carve out what piece is mine? What am I here to do? And what is in front of me that I can make a difference on? And as you continue to work in your sphere of influence, your sphere increases rather than just kind of losing energy to where you actually aren't even making a difference.
Warm welcome to Intersections. Our aspiration in this podcast is to help all of us explore what are our fullest capacities, individually and collectively, to be able to live meaningful lives and do our life's most beautiful work. We have today in our midst somebody who exemplifies this quality of doing her life's most beautiful work and expanding herself to her fullest capacities so wonderfully, so especially. Ellen Agler, a renowned changemaker, public health leader. She's worked in global health and humanitarian response for over 25 years in more than 70 countries. Organizations she's worked for include Operation Smile and the International Medical Corps. She's been named at one of Fortune magazine's World 50 Greatest Leaders recently. She is today the CEO of the End Fund. This is a philanthropic initiative set up to control and eliminate the 5 most commonly neglected tropical diseases in the world that affect over 1.5 billion people. Ellen serves, amongst others, on the board of the World Economic Forum's Global Health Security Advisory and is the co-author of the book Under the Big Tree: Extraordinary Stories from the Movements to End Neglected Tropical Diseases. Educational life, she has a degree in international health from the Harvard School of Public Health and in development studies from the London School of Economics. She's also completed a study in conflict resolution from the University de Javeriana. I'm going to mess that up. I'm going to ask Ellen to come and pronounce that for me. It's in Spanish, in Bogota, Colombia. Ellen, what a joy and what an honor to have you in our midst. Thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for such a kind introduction.
My joy. And before I move forward, help me correct my, great sort of mess up with that pronunciation of the university in Bogota, given my lack of knowledge about all things Spanish.
It's Universidad de la Javeriana. Yeah, I had the great opportunity to live in Bogota for a couple of years. It's been over 20 years now. So I was there from 1999 through 2001. Actually, that's where I was when 9/11 happened, and took courses on conflict resolution. It was a certificate program that was a pretty small group, but it was attended by someone who was the chief of police, someone who was a former member of M19 guerrilla group, someone who was working on the Peace Commission. It was just a phenomenally interesting, very active group. And one of my biggest excuses for taking that course was everyone was trying to practice their Spanish with me when I was trying to learn Spanish. And I figured if I did an academic course where everyone had to speak Spanish, it was a remarkable experience. But thank you.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. And, it's a glimpse into your very adventuresome spirit. Have you, over the course of your life then in so many different parts of the world, ended up sort of learning other languages as well? Is that one of your passions?
Unfortunately, like many Americans, I think I didn't take learning languages very seriously growing up. I took a little French, I took a little Spanish, but it wasn't until I started working in international health that I thought, oh, this would be incredibly useful to actually go deeper and have another language, but and maybe a little Portuguese from my thing and working in the region. But otherwise, yeah, it's something I wish I was invested in more. It's so beautiful. And I even feel like you must feel this. There's a different part of yourself that you tap into when you speak a different language. There are things that I feel more comfortable saying in Spanish, or seem cheesy to say in English, but seem beautiful to say in Spanish. Or there's just a soul to a language that opens up a new part of yourself, as well as helps you connect with a culture and people in a completely different way. What languages do you speak, Chandra?
I'm not that super literate, from a language standpoint. So Hindi, which is my native language, a little smattering of Punjabi, which is kind of like a sister language, not too disparate from Hindi, and then English. And I have a lot of regrets. I'd love to have known Sanskrit, another of like ancient India's languages, the classical language from India, the language of India's religious scriptures. I would have loved to know Urdu, which is this fusion of like Persian and Hindi that got manifested under Mughal rule in India, and that has been often the language of some of like the arts, in northern India and the in the Mughal periods of the last several hundred years prior to British rule, and then of course some of these international languages as well. I would have loved to. My daughter has quite a gift for languages, but somehow that passed me by.
I don't know. Speaking three languages is pretty good.
Well, I agree with you that knowing at least two, I think, can have a very liberating impact on one's own psyche, right? Because you're able to step back then from a culture and a way of being to another culture, another way of being. And that allows you to have more capacity to be able to have perspective on each of those cultures, and therefore make more choices about what you're going to do in your, I guess, ways of thinking, right? I mean, so that value I definitely see in my switching back and forth between Hindi and English.
And what do you find about yourself is able to be expressed differently in Hindi versus English?
I grew up with a deep draw towards, the pursuit of enlightenment, devotional connection to the creative spirit. And there are these things called bhajans, these chants, this devotional music that made a deep, deep, deep imprint on me in those early years. There is at times a celebration that happens, at times where you're meant to like stay up the whole night, just getting together with the harmonium, this musical instrument.
I love the harmonium.
Oh yeah, okay, lovely. Yeah, and then somebody chants, and then somebody else chants, and then everybody joins as a group, and you just keep going with that devotional ardor. I was just revisiting George Harrison's song "My Sweet Lord." You're familiar with that one, Ellen?
I'll have to look that one up. I haven't actually listened to his music from that period. I love listening to like Krishna Das's chanting and Jai Uttal and some of the Americans who picked up that devotional call and response.
Okay, I'll send you a reference to this one. It's a really beautiful way of a Westerner coming in and tuning into that sensibility and then bringing it into a form that could permeate popular consciousness in America and beyond. So it's a beautiful expression of that same sort of. So yes, when I'm doing chanting in Hindi, it has a certain very special impact as one example.
I mean, is it called kirtan in the Indian
Yes, yeah,
context as
kirtan.
well?
Yeah, kirtan.
That is just another way of singing about love of God and all of the different manifestations. And what is it? Bhakti yoga is like one of the forms of yoga that is just about how to express love and love of other, love of the divine. And so thinking about those kirtan songs, I always think of them as love songs. And they really do, when you're in a group of people singing and chanting the divine, it just can be really elevating and inspiring and just kind of transcendent in a way that you think about maybe like Rumi and the whirling dervishes did dancing, and this particular tradition of singing, like it just elevates your sense of being. And also singing in community as an amazing way of just connecting you with everybody else in the room. You may not know them, you might even know their name, but you're connected through this vibration of your voice.
Yeah, so true, so true. Everything you say has such deep resonance for me. I'm flashing back to the time that we were in Istanbul and old Istanbul, and very keen to experience a little bit of the whirling dervishes and go up there. And we were a little cautioned because we had like a small child with us. Our daughter was a little baby at that time, and we were fearful that what if she breaks into a cry or something and is impatient and all of that in the middle of this very devout kind of like sacred moment. And so the Islamic orchestra starts and these whirling dervishes are doing their very mystic twirling, and it was incredible. It went on for about an hour and a half, and she was just so captivated herself. There's something in just that energy right there which transported her soul, I think, to the same place it did ours. And so I want to invite you, if you don't mind, like go back to the very early days. I'm curious about sort of what got you started in pursuing, social impact causes, and And even prior to that, I know that you were pursuing journalism, for a while, and how even that got started like at a really young age. So, if you go back to the time you were like 14 or so, and yeah, there's like a very remarkable glimpse that we get into fierceness of like independence in you, that from a very early age was kind of charting your own path. Could you talk a little bit about sort of those early days when you were like flying out of the nest?
Well, it's interesting because you talk about moments when you were 10 years old of feeling connected to the beginnings of your spiritual journey. I mean, I grew up, my dad was in the Air Force, and so we moved around a lot. I think that had a lot of influence on the course of my life in terms of being around a lot of different cultures, a lot of different types of people, different communities, and learning to be an observer, to recognize that like just needing to figure out what the new dynamics were of where I was meant stepping back, being the observer, trying to assess the lay of land, and recognizing that things that were deeply held by a community one place weren't even considered in another place. And so it made it just confusing to me often when people just like were so strongly held to certain beliefs that they thought were universal, when actually I think it led me on a quest of what is universal and what does connect people. And even I might have mentioned to you, like I grew up, my father was Republican, my mom is Democrat, like a relationship that hardly even happens anymore, but like really having so much love and respect for each other. Yeah, I loved writing. I remember when I was really young, I used to have slumber parties that were all about like bring your novel in progress and we'll all work on it. And I just loved, yeah, the art of observation. When we moved at one point from the Washington, D.C. area when I was about 14 to Mountain Home, Idaho, which was a town of 15,000 people, pretty remote. And it was like, probably it's funny because I've lived in many countries and cultures, but somehow that within the US experienced the greatest culture shock that I ever have. And it was, yeah, I think at the time I wanted to like I wanted to write more. They didn't have a school newspaper. And I got connected to the local newspaper there. And they were like, well, why don't you just come and work for us? Why don't you come and have an internship here? And just fell in love with that opportunity. It was like I have this free pass to go ask people questions and dig into finding out what's behind things and write things that were relevant to people in the community. And that was a whole range of things that I got to do in that first journalism role. And then when I decided, like, actually, I really wanted to move out of that small town into the capital Idaho's Boise, Idaho, I presented a whole proposal to my parents, written out and costed, and where I'm going to live and where I'm going to go to school, and I had already lined myself up with speaking to the largest paper, USA Today Gannett paper, and they offered for me to come and do some articles there and work as a copy editor. So yeah, that was the probably flying from the nest. At 16, I moved out or to pursue my career as a journalist. Fast forward a few years, I had an editor who was saying, you're getting way too attached to the stories that you're doing. Because I would do all these stories on, at the time it was Bosnian refugees that were resettling in Idaho, or the Idaho Commission for the Blind was having financial troubles, or there's many different things that I would end up volunteering for that community or that refugee center, or to read books to the blind. Because he said, maybe you're in the wrong profession and you should, instead of writing stories, you should follow them and become part of the change. And that's a little oversimplistic in terms of my thought process about the time, but it was a pivotal conversation for me. And in looking at, okay, when I graduate with my degree, I would love to look for going into the Peace Corps or Foreign Service at the time I looked at. And that's when I got connected to Operation Smile. And that was my first foray into global health. And I fell in love with that work. It was so transformational, so clear the impact, such an incredible family who founded the organization. And just to see the power of what individual family could grow, what a single idea, like it was just being that close to the founders also and seeing that energy and momentum. Yeah, really just didn't turn back from that point and knew that was the career that I wanted to stay in.
So this moment where you sort of walk away from a first love, which was like writing, creative writing and reporting, into being part of the story and shaping the story, was that a fairly sort of emotionally like just a simple step, or was there some struggle at all in giving up something that you had a lot of fondness for, this dream of seeing yourself in writing mode and enjoying the process of writing, and now seeing that to be less and less a part of your daily work?
I think there was a couple things. One, I took a class my freshman year of college with Robert Thurman at Columbia in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. It was pretty profound to me, the scope of that worldview and the depth of the teachings. And in something called the Eightfold Path in Buddhism is one of the 8 pieces is a right livelihood. And how do you live a life that is aligned with your highest values? And I just think I started thinking actually a life in service of others in a more direct way. I think journalism can feel sometimes quite indirect. Matter of fact, it's interesting because one of the founders of the End Fund, the original funders, read an article in the Financial Times where they learned about neglected tropical diseases. And we stayed in touch with that journalist. And he's like, it's like one of the one stories I know that somebody read, somebody acted on, and amazing things happened because of, like, they definitely wouldn't have gotten into neglected tropical diseases if that wasn't for that one article. I'm picking up the phone and calling the people who were quoted in that article. And now, we've treated hundreds of millions of people later. Yeah, I think between that course and then, to be completely honest, I've always been like a highly sensitive person. And that has manifested in different ways in terms of emotionally, yeah, just struggling sometimes. And I think that honestly, the pursuit of writing, especially in that like late teens, early 20s, was really painful. There's like you finding your voice, you finding like, what do you have to write about when you don't even have all this life experience? That's why I liked journalism. So like, okay, very clear what I was, but like the idea of the time wanting to write, be a novelist or something. And I just like the discipline that it was required, and all of the autobiographies of writers that I was reading were so tortured at the time. And I almost could see myself just going down this somewhat tortured path of like, in my mind. And yeah, so I think it was honestly like partly grappling with depression at that age and realizing like a way out, a way of kind of pulling yourself out of your own quicksand is to be of service to others. And that like really tangible clarity of like, this child isn't going to get a cleft lip and palate surgery if I don't pull this team together. This person won't get, and like step by step of just kind of being connected to a broader whole, a broader piece of the universe, like that your life is interconnected with those around you. And it just felt like not going down the rabbit hole of kind of what happened to me. And it happens to many writers, like as in the isolation of writing, that it can be really, yeah, really hard. And so I think I found in like my first role with Operation Smile, just like the sense of connection to community that I had never felt before, and a community of incredibly selfless people volunteering their time, taking off their vacations from work in order to provide, children that they, would never see again, transformational surgery. There was just so many incredible donors, so many, like the whole community that made it happen. And I just felt like I found another part of myself and another energy for what is possible in life and how tangibly we can think about helping each other, like philosophical in terms of in service to others. But I feel it's so interesting. The things that I've done over the course of my life have been so tangible. It's like, this certain child needs this surgery, and how can we ensure that we provide it and provide training to the community of doctors to all be better at that? Or, after a natural disaster, when like medical care is needed because there's so many crush injuries, you need to bring orthopedic surgeons. Or right now, it's like medicines to people who otherwise would go blind and be disabled, or the clarity of surgery. So I actually feel incredibly lucky to be able to think I've not only enjoyed the joy of service and community, but having this like pick one problem and just work away at it. Because I know that, many people that I come into encounter with like get really paralyzed by the size of problems in the world, by the size of things that need to change. And it's crushing when you can't carve out like, what piece is mine? What am I here to do? And what is in front of me that I can make a difference on? And as you know, continue to work in your sphere of influence, it increases rather than just kind of losing energy to where you actually aren't even making a difference.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. It's very poignant. That struggle you mentioned that creative minds can have at times. I want to come back to that actually for a moment. But before we do that, I'm reminded of this little conversation that happened once between Abraham Lincoln and this senator when they were in a carriage going somewhere. And Lincoln made the claim to the other gentleman that all human motivation ultimately comes from a certain selfish purpose to pursue your own happiness. And then at one point in their journey, Lincoln noticed, I think it was like a little piglet, right, who was getting caught in a swampy land, and his mother was looking woefully at like losing her little child to the marshy land, and the child was sinking, the piglet. And Lincoln looked and said, "Stop this carriage!" And then he goes out and he saves the piglet and brings it back to its mother. Then he comes back to the carriage, and then the senator looks at him and says, "Mr. Lincoln, you just proved me wrong, isn't it? Because look at it, your motivation came from being selfless, not selfish." And Lincoln said, no, it came from being selfish, because like I was going to be so unhappy if I'd allowed ourselves to keep driving forth when this was happening around us. I did it for my happiness. I see you saying that. I see you talking about how you and this community of wonderful volunteers who are doing this beautiful work in helping cure the cleft lip and all of that. I mean, you're ultimately bringing a lot of joy back to yourself. And if any or all of us can really experience that and live that and see that, my God, what a more beautiful world we can create, knowing that there doesn't have to be a tension or a conflict between doing the right thing from a moral, ethical, social standpoint, and also feeding one's own hungers.
And I think it's being willing to act on those impulses. Sometimes I see the action that people are taking is more complaining or just tweeting about terrible things happening in the world, rather than like, what can you tangibly do to make a difference? But yeah, I mean, definitely it's improved my happiness a lot to be in service of others. And I think that's just some of the happiest people I know have figured out what's the role of service to others in their life. But also there's something deep. I mean, I definitely remember as when I was young, just if I saw like anybody abusing a dog or a child, that felt like there was this roaring goddess. Like I would just scream, or I would like some part of me would come out of just to defend. That I was like, sometimes it wasn't even safe for me to be that bold. And so you don't know like where those things come from to like protect the vulnerable or step in to do something about injustice. And there probably are people who sense that more sensitively than others, and others who it's more of a, just watched Oppenheimer this week. Have you seen that film yet?
Yeah, I did too.
When he was young and like this, uh, the intellect of like connecting a story about the universe and how to see things. And there's one of his teachers, like, it's not just about understanding it, it's about hearing the music. So it's like, and I thought that's such a beautiful way to put it. Like he's hearing the music of physics in that case. What music are you hearing? What is your particular type of music?
Let's come back to the creative arts for a moment, the writing crafts. And for the writers amongst us, right, amongst the listeners and our audience, I want to connect the dots a little bit between what you were saying there and then what you just said more recently, because I think there is a lesson there, and I want to test it with you. It's part of an evolving thesis I have, what maybe something that we could do to help advance the arts. And I'm just curious to see how you react to it, and I could be way off or partially right, or or right, I don't know. So that tested with you. And what I noticed several years ago is how there were these shifts happening in the art world. And there was a lot of sort of focus on just a certain form of self-expression, as though that was like the highest pursuit of an artist, was just like expressing whatever feelings and thoughts were deeply felt in you. And then also what I noticed several years ago when my daughter was in middle school is that the books that were being prescribed, had several of them had a very dystopian like sort of quality, as to painful state of the world, and it only gets from bad to worse, and there's just like a lot of evil among the power, full people in the world, and that's it. It's a very sorry state of affairs. And I was like, whoa, wait a second, isn't there a redemptive kind of like end to this? Isn't there questing that the hero makes towards something? Isn't there some kind of like heroic end to this or something like that? And for some of these novels, there wasn't that. And I could predict to you that time, I could predict to you the coming mental health crisis amongst teens, that we are seeing today. Because I was like, if you're gonna just bombard your mind just with dystopia, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be Pollyannic, like, unhinged form of like utopian thinking when the world around you consists of a lot of pain and suffering. I mean, I think it does make sense to be very grounded in the harsh realities. And then what you did in the last part of your conversation is you provided us that connective tissue between redemptive possibilities and the pain of like not seeing things go well in the world, which is do something about it. Don't just see it around you. Don't just have a sensitive heart, but do something about it. And so my hypothesis is that somebody who's an aspiring writer, who wants to be a writer, who's seeing how tortured some of the souls were, writers, perhaps the conclusion doesn't need to be necessarily that writing as a career, as a path, is doomed to be torturous, but to ask yourself, who are the exemplars within the writing profession who have had an intention behind their writing that is not merely to express the pain they're feeling, etc., but to be of service to the world in some positive way, to find a way to lift human consciousness, to shape and help people direct their energies towards some positive action, and to use the power of the pen, to kind of help people. I mean, at some level, I see Shakespeare as an example of that, and Tennyson and some poets from those ages. And anyway, I don't know what you think of that, but
I love it. I think definitely, we go in cycles and chapters of different cultures, chapters of humanity, chapters of the world. And I definitely think that, I don't know if it's the novels being read in school as much as like the news that we turn on and reading about school shootings or the impact of climate change, or like can feel pretty dystopian. And I think we have to curate our own inputs, because there we need a lot of hope in order to lead us to action. And that sense of like hopelessness is what leads people to kind of inaction and collapsing inside of yourself. And if we are here to help co-create the world with each other, then having stories, I mean, this is so known by politicians, like stories of hope sell more than stories of doom. And stories of, I mean, for me, I feel like I'm surrounded by so many stories of hope. I actually, probably because I work with so many change makers and people who are, so practically doing such incredible things in the world. And that I think, wow, there's immense possibility for what the next chapter can be. Or sometimes it's just scaling back and looking at things from a much longer time horizon of what is possible. And, we've, we live in a time where there's so much less poverty in the world than there ever was. There's so much more access to opportunity and education and information. And there's a downside of too much information, but actually the liberating capacity of that is so amazing as well, that I think it's just, you have to find your own path. And for me, it was going to be a longer route. And which is why maybe even me having a co-author for my book was really helpful, because then it was a collaborative endeavor. And writing a book that ended up being about how can I tell the stories of people suffering from these diseases so that more people can take action. That was a different type of book than I would have written 20, 30 years ago. But for some people, like, writing is the way that they heal themselves. Like, that's the only way that they can think clearly, is if they're writing and need to write it out to express themselves. But I mean, you touch on something that I'm extremely concerned about, especially as a mom of a teenage daughter, which is the mental health crisis going on in our world. And I think part of it is how much weight they feel from, seeing how many problems there are in the world, that they're the generation that has to solve them. It's a different time. I'd love if you think about how can you elevate whatever artistic endeavor that you're in to help create stories of hope and possibility and transformation.
I got that little spark from a thought that I read from Gandhi, and he said that to me the only thing that qualifies as art is something that ultimately helps to advance human consciousness closer towards its divine identity. So it's just an interesting idea, right?
It's pretty purist view, though. I mean, it's also art as a expression of the many, many facets of humanity, and of all of the different ways that human beings can be in the world, and can, if it's to share like darkness, that is part of being human also.
Well, so this is an interesting thought, right? So, and I'm just going to again test it with you, like my build on what you just said, which is my thesis is that if you focus on darkness and then just stop there, then that's one kind of outcome that you'll get. And then if you focus on darkness and then move it from that shake up, wake up, opening of eyes and sensitizing, yourself and the community to that, and then move it from there into now, what are we going to do about it? Now, what are we going to do about it? Like what I've just shared is kind of what I've learned from cognitive behavior therapy. And, there's Dr. David Burns is a preeminent, people have these automatic negative thoughts like, nobody loves me, or like I'm terrible at work, or like I'm not a good dancer, or whatever it might be. And like one of the breakthroughs that cognitive therapy helps people achieve is this thing that you don't like shy away from honoring the uncomfortable truths and some of those like maybe dark aspects of what you're going through, but then you always like end with that flourish of, but like, now what am I going to do about it? And that's
What
from
I
where
think is
agent.
true. Which is asking, is that even true that I'm a terrible dancer or that I'm not lovable? Like,
Yes. So in some cases, you challenge that because maybe your view of darkness is a very distorted view of the world. To the extent it's a true view of some aspect of the world, then anyway. And that's what you've done. You had this sensitive heart. You had it for all the injustices and pain you saw in the world, and you just like directed your whole life towards it. What moved you from those early forays into social service and humanitarian work to ultimately coming to the end fund?
it was not some sketched out path. I think I think it's as many things in life happens. It's just you do the next best thing, do the next thing that is on offer. And I was very proactive, certainly in looking for different opportunities, but also, I would have never guessed that the End Fund would have been created at the time. In that case, it was a recruiter who reached out to me, and I already had a role at the End Fund, and I was thinking I wasn't looking for another job, but actually this was so compelling from the size of the problem that we would have a chance to tackle. Part of my view of the world is a bit utilitarian in terms of how can you do the greatest good for the greatest number? And, that pragmatic utilitarian. And I'm also optimistic, but I'm also just, okay, if there are solutions and interventions and that can help people at scale, then that that has to be done. Like someone should do it. And I remember going to my first interview thinking, well, I don't think I'm very qualified for this job because I didn't study neglected tropical diseases and I haven't been a CEO before. But I was so obsessed with learning about these diseases and reading everything about them. And I was so fascinated at the scale of the problem and how few people knew about them that I went with a whole list of notes of things that I thought whoever got the job might want to take forward. That I was just like, this funding source and this conference and this, like, and they sort of laughed. They were like, well, first of all, you were one of the only people who knew how to pronounce the diseases. And I think that sense of probably my innate thing of like, oh, that is a problem that should be solved. And my problem solving proactive nature just started on that path. And even though I had my own self doubt, I mean, a lot of people do, like sense of imposter syndrome or am I really ready for this? And I was, I was 39 when I became CEO of the End Fund. Am I too young? Whatever the story that I had in my mind was. And then just to be like, well, if they want me to try it, then just try it. Then we'll build it. And it's luckily I was the CEO of an idea at the beginning until we built it and hired more people and created an organization. So yeah, a this is my 12th year and I've just absolutely loved this journey and met so many incredible people along the way and continue to learn and really just feel like part of a part of a global community that is working on a common vision and roadmap to end these diseases. So it just feels like a great meta collaboration on many levels, getting away from competition within a particular sector because there's so much competition in the NGO nonprofit world. And sometimes people that are working on the exact same thing can just clash. And it felt like this is an under-resourced area with not enough people working on it and a huge desire for collaboration. And the End Funds model as a philanthropic collaborative was how do we mobilize more resources, not just for our own view of how we're going to end neglected diseases, but how do we support whoever is best placed in whatever community to help move the whole agenda forward. So it's like all ships will rise if the sea rises. And that has been really nice to just think, because I think that the scale of collaborating to solve global problems is often not thought about, of like who are the system entrepreneurs and what's the ecosystem of support between organizations, not just siloed within organizations, that needs to be developed. And so that whole field of system entrepreneurship and systems leadership has just fascinated me. And I think that this community of folks working on neglected tropical diseases really exemplifies systems leader thinking.
Very cool. So let me make sure I understand you correct. So you have both programs that you design and execute on your own as the end fund, and at the same time, you're integrated with this ecosystem and helping support other organizations that provide channel and access and delivery or et cetera to certain parts of the world to help alleviate these neglected diseases. Is that right?
Mostly don't implement programs ourselves. So I would consider like 80% of all of our funding goes to grant making to others. So it is funding governments, funding local NGOs, funding academic partners, and ensuring that there's collaboration and not overlap between those partners. And so that is a big emphasis on resource mobilization. But in order to raise funds, you also have to tell stories about this work, do advocacy. And so the more that we've grown in this space, we have a role of technical assistance. We have some incredible technical experts that support governments and partners. We do work on monitoring and evaluation. We do commissioning reports that on the state of the sector, a lot of convening, so that we're bringing people together from different countries and different parts of these disease areas. We're, communications, really trying to do more on getting the financing right. So working on health financing, both for the private sector and the public sector. So I think that it's sort of like what are the key levers that are needed across the whole system? And it's more resources, more convening, more thought, more research. We would end up supporting that, well as we would make grants to organizations that are actually, and it's mostly to governments, like that have within their health systems, can deliver medicines, can provide care, and they're just incredibly resource constrained. And that allows us to kind of hold a systems view without having to also be, hire hundreds of thousands of community health workers to be, in every village delivering, which wouldn't make sense anyway, because it should be those villages deciding themselves what's the best way of getting care out to their community.
So, what are some other aspects of like society and the world where you feel this model is missing right now? And if it could be successfully implemented, it might make a significant difference in the way resources are coordinated, best practices are shared, and all of that. It does sound to me like you're making a very important point. And I always kind of intrigued about how when somebody is doing really good work in a certain arena, I feel like there are two stories playing out, and I want to test this with you. One is the story of what they're doing, but the other is the story of what is emulatable. What is that they're doing, which is coming from that place of a universal truth that you were saying early in your life. You got very drawn to like, what are those universals? So I'm just thinking about like in the end fund and this kind of system, entrepreneurship that you're doing in social impact, what is the universal truth here that perhaps could benefit, other parts of social impact work as well and beyond?
I like to say, like, leave your ego and your logo behind and make collaboration a higher priority than organizational survival, even. Like, if your organization is not needed anymore, be okay with that rather than just empire building, which can happen in the nonprofit, because sometimes it's like not philanthropy can be delinked to market forces, and it can be because, so I think the other thing is just being really willing to support system catalysts who can take analytical looks at how all of the different actors work together. So what is that system map? And because people are so busy doing their thing in their organization, sometimes they don't have time to step back and have a system map view. And there was one story I heard once that was like all the organizations in San Francisco got together, and if they combined their budgets, they could keep every single homeless person in the Ritz-Carlton, and they're still not solving homelessness. But it was once, and this has happened in a number of different cities working on homelessness, once it's like, okay, what are individual organizations? They're trying to be good at everything, rather than like, what are you best at? And lean in on that. And the other one that's best at something, lean in on that. And then the way that those services connect might actually be have a greater impact than the way that the ecosystem is structured right now. So I feel like there's many. I mean, I've been curious about this, back to our conversation about mental health in young people, especially in the United States, that I have visibility on. Like, what it seems very fractured. It seems very much based on what insurance do you have and what gets covered and who can make a livelihood in this work, and long waiting lists, and or you need to get services through schools and only if you can afford private services. So there's so much that's burdened by the way the health system works. And there's so much that's from a sort of a point of care when there's a crisis, rather than what's creating resilient and what's preventing mental health crisis, rather than just once you get to the most acute form. I don't know what that solution would be, but I definitely feel like there needs to be some more system thinking around this issue. I'm pretty close to an organization called the Freedom Fund that works on ending modern day slavery. And it's been really wonderful to see the impact that they've had. Like when they first were started, I mean, sometimes they call human trafficking and modern day slavery like a data free zone, because it's essentially crime. And so it's very hard to get accurate statistics about how many people are currently being trafficked or are currently living in conditions of slavery. And so that there was two main bodies, the International Labor Organization and then an organization called Walk Free, that were doing their own analysis of this and then putting out numbers of the global burden of slavery is X. And they were widely different. And that wasn't helping with advocacy because people just got confused. And so once they helped create a platform for those organizations to collaborate, it's like, okay, let's at least work on methodology together. Let's work on common messaging. And so there was like much more collaboration at a global level, which helped unlock additional funding, got more attention for that issue. And then the other thing, at a micro level, they would focus on hotspots of slavery, like the Nepal-India border, for example. The story about the Nepal to India border was that there was small organizations working on the issue on both sides of the border, but that weren't talking to each other. So people were having their, children trafficked from Nepal into India, and there were services there, but they didn't have anything on the prevention side. They weren't sharing information between organizations. So they might have one place where they're like, okay, the number of bonded laborers has gone down here, but it's actually gone up in the community next door. So is that really a overall reduction of burden? And just to fund a whole ecosystem of organizations and to fund the collaborative glue to bring them together and share best practices was really instrumental in helping to reduce that burden and to increase everything from resilience programming to litigation to policy change. So I think there's a lot of issue areas like that, from education to climate. I mean, climate, I've seen the Climate Funders Network that's brought together funders who were previously everybody funding their own projects of how they thought things should be moving forward, to like, are we actually using the collective resources to best and highest use? And how do we align funding, or, you know, just really share information, share due diligence, so that not everybody's doing due diligence on the same organizations 10 times over. So there's so many great ways to impact that.
I'm so glad that this has come up in our conversation, because I see this as a very thought-provoking, I think, observation from you that will, I hope, be of enduring value to so many amongst the listeners who are very inspired and invested in their own causes, but sometimes you don't see the forest from the trees, and that's what you're really highlighting, is that there's a whole other level that somebody needs to take stewardship and ownership over. I can easily imagine somebody like a Paul Hawken, for example, from the environmental movement, would really celebrate, right, the message you're delivering, because he's so zoomed out and he has such a capacious capacity, to kind of look across the whole thing and appreciate and empathize with the whole, diverse set of positions and points of view and all of that, as to what we need to do to help advance the environmental movement. How is the United Nations, in your eyes, doing on this front to act as a body through which some of this kind of more, collective coordination and systems thinking can be brought to bear?
I'm probably not the best one to ask. I mean, I worry about I think that the aspiration of the United Nations is so important. And right now it's the one entity we have for global coordination that's agreed on. So there's such an urgency to make it work. Yet it is kind of stuck in like a post-World War II, who has power on the Security Council. And, it's a really, really tough and it's one country, one vote. It just feels like every time really trying to get big things done at the United Nations, it's so political and so bogged down and so complex. And also there's been so many scandals with like keepers actually being forces of evil because of, rape and spread of cholera and lot. So it's such a big institution. It's almost like the elephant where you touch it one place, if you're blind and you don't know what it is. I can say that my most interaction with the UN right now is the World Health Organization. And I am vastly hopeful about what WHO can accomplish and undergo a lot of criticism all the time, but they are, one former head of the WHO told me people expect so much from WHO, yet they have the budget of like a mid-sized hospital in the UK. And for but governments look to them, not necessarily the US, but most governments, especially in the developed country, are looking to them for technical guidance, for recommendations about how to run healthcare systems. They can't have a disease expert in every single area. And so they really rely on WHO. And in the case of neglected tropical diseases, WHO helps to gather applications from countries on what drugs they need. And they facilitate a multi-billion-dollar drug donation program every year to get medicines to places that are needed, which is incredible. They're been hugely proactive in convening and thought leadership around how to move the NTD agenda forward. They helped get just thousands of peace partners input to create what's now the NTD Global Roadmap to 2030. So I just think from that technical convening authority perspective, it's the only time that all ministers of health from around the world get together is the WHO Health Assembly to talk about health is not confined to borders, as we know very well now. So I really feel like I have a lot of hope in WHO. And then UNICEF, I've seen have tremendous impact. I mean, they certainly also have helped work on with us. How do we integrate deworming more into child health programs? How do you advocate for deworming being a part of a school health package so that kids, it's not just the better curriculum that they need to be healthy when they're at school. So I just see so many intelligent, thoughtful, well-educated, like committed people working inside the UN system. Yet, as any big system is, there's real challenges, and they can just be incredibly political. I feel like certainly UN reform overall would probably be really helpful, yet it's difficult to achieve. What is your view on the UN? Have you collaborated much with the UN? It's so hard for me to say the UN because to me it's like if you don't break it down into like this piece that you understand or this piece that you collaborate with, it's, making an overall judgment is hard.
Yeah, it is a multi-headed beast, isn't it? And like you said, on the one hand, we have to feel super thankful that this experiment that began after the Second World War actually has sustained itself and, for the most part, has provided a certain connective tissue, on world issues that has also kept a little bit of a watch and a little bit of care on, how we like really deal with each other as humanities across borders and all of that. And yet, I do have my struggles with, bureaucracy and politics and the need to maintain a certain like purity of intent and a resolute executional focus, which I think as soon as organizations become that large and multidimensional and with multiple stakeholders and all of that, and decision making by committee and votes and all of that, it's just very, very hard to do some of life's best work. And so I guess part of me is like just praying for it, praying. But I also realize that behind that, like you said, lies a number of very deeply entrenched power structures, and so really it's a reflection of the nations and the sponsors and the leaders behind them, and that's where the real change has to really be manifested. I mean, how much can someone do just within the United Nations to make change happen if the leaders who are sponsoring and the nations who are behind it, right, don't evolve themselves too? I don't know if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. I always wonder if we didn't have the UN, who would fill that purpose? And that's my concern is like, I actually think we need a UN to have some convening power and place to have conversations that the world agrees is that forum to do it. And it would be hard to rebuild that now at a time where everyone, so many countries are becoming more and more insular and isolationist. Who would decide that kind of structure now? Like the fact that it was even created as a miracle to hold especially collaboration on things like climate, the environment more broadly, global, just it's amazing how many just different accords on protection of the oceans, like the UN is so pivotal to. But in many cases, same with the World Health Organization, WHO is one actor of a whole ecosystem of governments and NGOs and academics. And like, how do we all march together toward, progress, recognizing, the UN can play a critical, but one part of the role.
Yeah, yeah. My one regret in what is otherwise, like you've just also so thoughtfully said, a deep appreciation for how in an imperfect world, you still have an institution like that, around. My one regret is that we have in the present moment in human consciousness a mindset in institutions that they have to showcase themselves as though they are perfect, as though whatever position they're taking, absolutely is the morally right one and is the right one. And they cannot present a little bit more of a state of humility and a state of like, let's have a unit within us that is constantly in a self-reflective mode about how do we need to transform ourselves, what are our limitations and weaknesses in the context of where humanity's gone versus where we are today, and being very open about some of its like struggles, in that regard, and taking steps towards moving themselves, from here to a better, institutional form tomorrow. That self-renewing, self-transforming aspect that we know is so critical for every family and human being. If we could create those structures as well as a very storied part of what an institution is. There is a department for that, like self-transformation. Perfectly fine to say that like we are a work in progress and we are not perfect. Because what I'm seeing is, and I don't know if you would agree with this or not, I'm seeing like almost like humanity is moving at a faster pace than institutions are moving. And institutions are holding humanity back, in some regards.
Well, you definitely see that right now about AI. Many things related to the internet. Institutions are so far behind just where progress is going. And like the idea of keeping up from an ethical perspective, from values, from regulatory perspective is hard to fathom. I don't know. I mean, I almost see when you're explaining that, I almost feel like you're suggesting literally a department of self-transformation. Like say we're at Columbia University and this group of people over there are going to think about our mistakes and how we can be transparent about it. And maybe that would be one way of institutionalizing it, but I also think it's just a framework of leaders inside the organization. Like that has to be so owned by everyone. And if you can demonstrate that your single classroom, like I don't have it perfect. This is our curriculum for the semester. This is what we're planning for, but I don't have it perfect. Turns out we should turn a different way, or you guys don't like this, or this isn't going to be that useful. We can turn this work. This is what I got. I built this based on the input from last year. Like it just constantly this, and I do feel like there's a lot of incentives to not share failure. So how do we create incentives to share it so that we can learn? And sometimes that is happening more and more. I see, but in pretty small settings. It's hard when it comes to the public, when it could affect your brand, it could affect your fundraising capacity, it could affect your, you know, shareholder value, whatever. Like people get very nervous about sharing too many failures. But I think actually when people authentically share what they're not good at, even as an individual, that's when you perk up because you're like, oh, you are also aren't perfect. Great. We're all at humanity working, trying to make the world better from a very imperfect place that we are ourselves. And we love this frame at the end fund. Everyone takes like a strength finder. So, Gallup started this years ago, and you're kind of, here's your top strengths, and you get them ranked, 1 through 32. And the point is everybody has strengths. And how do you actually lean into what your strengths are and not put people in roles where they really are going to fail at that, or even within that role, if they did a certain way, then they would thrive. And I definitely feel like we've had many, oftentimes at team retreats, discussions about here's what the strength map profile looks like for your department, for this level of the organization, and what's missing and how do we lean into it more. So it's a way that feels safer than saying, what are your failures? So I don't know. I like the idea of the founding head of programs for the End Fund used to always call it a commitment to reflective practice. And that would be like taking time to have an after action report that was facing the brutal facts. Like, how did this really go? How could this have gone better? Let's just not celebrate it now that we're at the end, but do you have these cycles for review and continuous improvement when we're in an environment where it's easy just to kind of like rush ahead and get on to the next thing, and then you end up repeating the same mistakes you had before? So I don't know. I mean, I definitely think we need to embrace it as institutions and as individuals more, just modeling that behavior.
And we're soon going to be having to wrap up. Want to be so grateful for the generosity of your spirit and time with us today. Before we, have to though, I'd be really keen, both for my own joy and experiencing more of your life journey, and for our listeners, if you could share, like a story of something that has brought you such a sense of fulfillment for all the sacrifice and the commitment and energy that you have been putting in, year upon year into helping and serve the world. What is like a story that your heart goes back to it from time to time, and it gives you a great sense of reaffirmation and a rejuvenation of spirit, not knowing that you were part of that story.
Oh my goodness, there's so many. This was many years ago. There was a program set up that was sort of birthed out of Operation Smile, and one of our funders who became a dear friend, she was particularly felt passionate about the kids that were not able to receive surgery that would come to screenings because their cases were just too complex. And it required not only just a simple cleft lip and palate surgery, but maybe neurosurgery, more complex anesthesia, more complex aftercare. And in particular, there's a high rate in the Philippines of a type of hydrocele, of encephalocele of the brain, and it would be herniated brain tissue, and it would start like the brain tissue would start coming out and up between your eyes and nose and kind of destroy the nose, widen the eyes, and you could have a tumor hanging off that would sometimes cover your eyes so that you couldn't see, and it might be like pound, 3 pounds, 5 pounds until it could get very large. And it was often children that had this. And so the stigma, sense of self, the not being allowed to go to school. And so we set up a program at the time. And it was just sort of like my volunteer work on the side. So it wasn't even like a core part of my main job. It was just to help set up this nonprofit that would bring these kids to Hawaii from the Philippines, receive surgery at Tripler Army Hospital, and then they would go stay on the Big Island. And it was a collaboration with the Nature Conservancy where she was also trying to protect indigenous native lands. And Hawaii is a place with a lot of sort of invasive species. And like, how do you protect the pure koa forest? And so it was like a protecting land and then also highlighting all of not only the surgery and neurosurgery and anesthesia that's needed, but all of the aftercare that you might have fixed, kind of physically this child, but what else could you do emotionally? And so there was like, art therapists, people swim with the dolphins, animal therapy. I mean, all sorts of the most beautiful, nature-based, compassionate therapy while they were there getting all of their follow-up care. So it's like 3 months. So it was an incredibly intensive program that you could only do like a handful of kids per year because of how intensive it was. And that project lasted like 10 years. So there was, say like between 30 and 50 kids total, something like that, that were taken care of. And I was very involved in the setup of it. So the first year I actually went to the Philippines to the Operation Smile mission, got the medical charts for the kids with more complicated care, took them back to Tripler. Anyway, and they came and got surgery. And one of the little girls was, maybe she was 8 at the time, Marianne. And so this is so long ago, like almost 20 years ago. And recently she found me on Facebook. And it was the most unreal thing because I don't even really check Facebook. I'm not active on Facebook, but she found and was sending me these notes that were like, just wanting you to know, I remember you from that time. My life has changed. I'm married now. I wanted to show you a picture of my firstborn baby. And if I hadn't gotten that surgery when I was a kid, I would have never had this life. And it was like, she finished her education. She was like beaming with happiness. And I think that was just touching because I think, sometimes it's very overwhelming, like especially at the end fund when the numbers are so large, when we're like over 100 million people we could treat, and it can just seem abstract. But then when it's back to like, oh, Marianne, like you should have a very different life because of the effort that I took and that others took to make this program happen. And we got a lot of criticism for that program because it was like, oh, it's over, it was too expensive. It was impractical. It wasn't replicable. All these things that are like, well, it's not impractical for that one person. It's not, this is the passion that this group of people had, and was able to live that out. And it doesn't matter that that organization didn't live on in history forever. It like was here to serve a beautiful cause, and it changed and transformed not only her life, but the life of everybody who was able to be a part of that story. I mean, that's one of, I had so many stories.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. It was very, very heartwarming to hear. And it's interesting because, like, now in the work you do in the End Fund, I mean, how many people are positively impacted by, all of the organizations that you work with and serve? You must have, I guess, some numbers around sort of on an annual basis or collectively over the last 10 years, the number of people who've gotten the right inoculations and things. And
Yeah, I'll have to look at the most recent data because it starts like, but we've delivered over 1 billion NTD treatments to almost 300 million people, but it's scaled over the years. So now it's over 100 million people per year in almost 30 countries. And I just saw we've been able to provide over 80,000 surgeries as well. And the surgeries are to stop blindness. Like one of the types of surgeries we do, which is like a $75 surgery, but when you have blinding trachoma, your eyelashes get infected, they start turning inwards. And so it feels like every time you blink your eye, like sandpaper is scratching across your eye. Extremely painful. And it will lead to irreversible blindness. But there's a surgery that you can do that just kind of flips the eyelashes back, take medicine to stop the recurrence of that infection. And not only does it stop the pain, but it stops the progression to blindness. So tens of thousands of people that are no longer at risk of being blind. And just this year, we're going to be providing more than 20,000 of those surgeries through our partners and supporting them.
yeah, incredible, incredible. Last question for you. What's the source of your energy? I mean, for you to be exuding so much joy with the heaviness of heart that one must inevitably feel, being embroiled and engaged with some of these struggles that still persist in humanity. We were just talking about that, what that can do to a writer, that can do to an artist. And here you are, you're really actively invested in these issues. You're probably from time to time reading and studying and encountering, these communities where, I mean, just the way you described the condition, for that one individual for whom, there was that, yeah, just outgrowth, right? It's so, challenging emotionally for one to face and take that. And so where do you nourish yourself most?
Probably the same way you do, that nourishment inside yourself, creating space for rest and contemplation and that home within your own heart that is just deeply restful. And so definitely having a yoga and meditation practice for me is important, spending time with friends, hiking, being in nature. And and I get energy from this work. It's not like I need energy from somewhere else to do the work. I get energy from this work because I love the people that I work with. The team at the End Fund is so smart and so inspiring, and I learn something from them every day. And I just feel the clarity of need and the clarity of what resources are needed. It's just like it needs to be done. And when there's an opportunity to communicate with potential funders or to lay out a plan to scale work, I just get a lot of energy from seeing it. And now there's been dozens of countries who have reached disease elimination goals. So there's been almost 50 years of efforts to eliminate river blindness in Africa. And just this year, was the first year that Niger and Senegal were able to eliminate. Togo eliminated lymphatic filariasis. We're on the brink of eradicating guinea worm. There's just so in terms of seeing like, wow, these are diseases that have been around for thousands of years that are referenced in the Bible. Like they on our watch in this generation, with our support, like we're lucky to be the ones that are here now to see that this turn in history from diseases that in the US, for example, we used to have trachoma and hookworm in the American South, and those diseases don't cause as much of a burden now. And everybody deserves to live a life free of preventable diseases. And this is just about giving the opportunity to everyone rather than just the privileged few. So part of the energy that comes when you love what you do.
So beautiful. You started a little bit with some of the inner kind of practices, and then you moved into, walks in nature, and then you come back to your actual work itself as a source of energy. So beautiful, so inspiring. You talked about the guinea worm, and that actually is funny that you say that, because as you were just talking, I was being reminded of Jimmy Carter, whatever I know about our former president, and how all through his life, until it seemed like his dying breath, he's just so deeply invested in wanting to, be of service, to humanity and manifest goodness. And one of those has been around the elimination of the guinea worm, his Carter Center. And so you were reminding me of his energy, and there you
Yeah,
are
no, the
talking
Carter Center is
about.
a major partner of ours and inspiration to me. And yeah, I have a book signed on my bookshelf by Jimmy Carter, thanking me for the work in this space. And it's very meaningful to me. He certainly set the pathway of saying just because the people are neglected and the diseases are neglected doesn't mean that people at the highest levels on the world stage shouldn't be talking about it and shouldn't be doing something about it. And I feel like he's like a clarion call to action for all of us that work in this space.
Yeah. I want you to have the last word. And so, as we bring this to closure, do think if there is one thing that you, as a message, want to offer, all our listeners as they go back inspired, by this conversation into their own lives and make the choices in the days and months ahead on how to like fully manifest their purpose in advancing whatever it is that there is their calling. As you think about that, let me just kind of like close out from my side with an offering for you. And it's a small little story. One of the surgeons who was in my class, he shared the story. He was doing some work with Doctors Beyond Borders, in Africa, and it had to do with cleft surgery. And there was this line of individuals who had come, from here and from there. And he said at this one point, there was this one individual that he was, doing the surgery for, an adult, and he had apparently, walked long distance, to come there and to get this moment, and he said, and I think like this worker who was working with me, a local, probably saw that I was kind of like a little bit sort of like disengaged or disgruntled or something, in that moment after that surgery. And so he comes up to me and he says, Dr. So-and-so, to the whole world, this person that you just did the surgery for, this might be just one human being. But I want to let you know that to this one human being, you are the whole world, what you've just done. And Ellen, I mean, you and your team and the End Fund and all of these wonderful people you collaborate with and all that you have served and again worked with in past years and these other very noble organizations. I mean, like my heavens, like each of these people that you have, transformed, like that individual who, connected with you on Facebook. I mean, to them, you are the whole world. And, today you are that to us as well. I'm so grateful for all you do.
Well, thank you for what you have done by creating this platform. And I just love this focus that you have on how do we support true human flourishing and the connection between inner change and outer change. And I mean, I think that so often these conversations are divided about what are we doing on our inner life and for our spiritual well-being, and what are the bigger questions about why we're all here to our work life. And if anything, I think you are shining a light on the universal truth that they're one. We are one. Like life is all one and there's no difference. And what you bring to your heart for one part of your life ends up spreading to the rest of your life. And I think that we need so much more integration of these conversations. So thank you for creating the platform for that.
Thank you so much. So grateful.
Thank you.